a charming stranger, a grieving widow, and a secret no one dared speak. Welcome to Warm Leaves. I am your host, Raven. Tell me where you're watching from. Your words keep our mysteries alive. Now, let's uncover the truth. The small village of St. Mary Mead had always seemed immune to the sort of scandal one read about in the London papers. Yet, on a pale autumn morning, the peace was disturbed when word began to circulate that Mrs. Margaret Ellison, a wealthy widow living in the grand ivy-covered house on the edge of the common, had been found dead in her drawing room. The details, whispered from door to door, were strange. There had been no sign of forced entry, nothing stolen, no struggle. She was discovered seated in her favorite chair as though she had simply fallen asleep, a faint smile upon her lips. But the village doctor, called promptly by her housemaid, declared that her death was far from natural. What puzzled everyone most was the single item left conspicuously on the low mahogany table beside her. A half-empty glass of sherry, untouched by her lips, and beside it a small playing card, the Queen of Hearts. It was Miss Marple, of course, who noticed at once how odd that was. A woman like Mrs. Ellison, practical, proper, and with little taste for frivolities, had no reason to be entertaining herself with playing cards. The Queen of Hearts felt like an intrusion, something placed there with purpose. The official investigation began almost immediately, with Inspector Craddock arriving from Much Benham. He questioned the housemaid, Alice, who seemed more frightened than grief-stricken. She explained that she had left her mistress in perfect health the previous evening. Mrs. Ellison had been expecting a guest for supper, Mr. Charles Denning, a charming gentleman who had recently returned to the village after many years abroad. The maid had laid 2 places at table and retired early. When she came down in the morning, she found the mistress exactly as she was now, with the strange card and untouched drink. Charles Denning's name stirred quiet murmurs in the village. He was handsome in a polished, almost practiced way, with a winning smile and a reputation for being attentive to wealthy ladies. It was widely known that Mrs. Ellison had enjoyed his company of late, though whether their relationship was romantic or merely friendly was the subject of speculation. When Craddock questioned Denning, he seemed genuinely shocked at the news. He claimed he had indeed dined with Mrs. Ellison, leaving shortly after 9. She had been perfectly well, he said, though a bit pensive. He had no idea what could have happened to her afterward. His alibi, that he had gone home and spent the remainder of the evening reading, was thin, but no one could disprove it. The coroner's report deepened the mystery. Mrs. Ellison had died of digitalis poisoning, though no such drug was found in the house. The sherry on the table contained no trace of it. There were no signs of a struggle, no sign she had consumed anything unusual. It was, as Craddock remarked in frustration, the neatest crime I've ever seen, neat to the point of impossibility. Miss Marple, who had been present during parts of the inquiry, ostensibly to bring Inspector Craddock some scones from the vicarage, listened with her usual air of quiet attentiveness. She said very little, but she thought a great deal. She knew Mrs. Ellison had always been a woman of sound judgment, not easily taken in by flattery. Yet of late, she'd seen her walking arm in arm with Denning in the lane, her face softened in a way unusual for the widow who had once declined every advance after her husband's passing. Miss Marple could not help but think of the Queen of Hearts, the card of love, romance, and sometimes dangerous infatuation. In the following days, the investigation turned over every stone. The maid was questioned repeatedly, Denning's movements were retraced, and the villagers recalled snatches of gossip. It was whispered that Mrs. Ellison had been considering a change to her will. If Denning had hoped to benefit, there was no proof. Her solicitor confirmed no recent alterations. Yet there lingered the sense of a plan carefully executed. The peculiar detail of the Queen of Hearts remained unexplained. Some suggested it was a token of love, perhaps left by Denning as a romantic flourish, though he denied any knowledge of it. Others thought it might be a cruel joke. Miss Marple, however, had seen something like this before, not in detail, but in principle. People, she often said, leave signs of themselves behind, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes to mislead. What struck her was how very still and composed the scene had been. The untouched sherry, the absence of struggle, the single card. It felt arranged, almost staged. The case might have stalled there were it not for a small piece of information dropped by Mrs. Price Ridley at a gathering in the tea room. She remarked that she had once seen Denning in London, many years ago, in the company of another wealthy widow who had died suddenly under circumstances that were never quite explained. Denning, of course, had vanished from the city shortly afterward. Miss Marple tucked this away, saying nothing. Coincidences were rarely just coincidences. On the following afternoon, she made her way quietly to Mrs. Ellison's house. She had an excuse ready, bringing some comfort to poor Alice, who seemed grateful for the company. Miss Marple's sharp eyes roamed the drawing room, noting details that had been overlooked. A small deck of cards on the bookshelf, arranged haphazardly, missing a single queen of hearts. She asked Alice, ever so gently, whether Mrs. Ellison had played cards recently. Alice shook her head. Her mistress had no interest in games. The deck, she thought, must have belonged to Mr. Denning, who had brought it on one of his visits. Miss Marple smiled, faintly, her mind beginning to align the pieces. A card left behind, not as sentiment, but as misdirection. A drink placed within sight, but never consumed. A poison administered not in the sherry at all, but elsewhere. By the time she left the house, she had the shape of it in her mind. The crime was not unsolvable. It had simply been constructed to appear so, and she knew precisely who had done it and why. Inspector Craddock was doing his best, but his efforts resembled a man trying to assemble a puzzle with all the wrong pieces. Interviews were repeated, facts noted and restated, yet the picture never came into focus. He came by the vicarage one afternoon, looking weary, to update Miss Marple, something he did under the pretense of politeness, though in truth he had begun to suspect her quiet mind caught more than she ever admitted. "There's nothing, Miss Marple," he said, standing awkwardly in the neat little sitting room. "No sign of poison in the sherry, no trace of it in the food, no fingerprints on the blasted card. The doctor swears the stuff had to be ingested within hours, and yet—" he shook his head. "It's as though she just decided to die politely in her chair." Miss Marple poured him tea and murmured sympathetically, but she did not offer solutions. Not yet. Her mind was turning over the details of Mr. Denning's visit and Alice's description of the evening. What struck her was not what had been said, but what had been left out. That evening she took a slow walk through the village, stopping by the Ellison house just as Mr. Denning happened to be leaving. He was immaculately dressed, with a silver-topped cane that caught the light. He removed his hat and smiled at her, all charm. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said warmly. "I was just paying my respects. Such a terrible business." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite. I trust you found Alice holding up well enough?" Denning's smile faltered just slightly, so slightly that another might have missed it. "As well as can be expected," he said, then offered a small bow and went on his way. Miss Marple watched him go, noting how he walked, confident, precise, but with the faintest stiffness in his left leg. She recalled something Mrs. Price Ridley had once mentioned about a trip to the Riviera, about Denning's supposed accident. It was curious how little Denning's past ever withstood close examination. When she stepped into the Ellison house, Alice greeted her with a nervous gratitude. Miss Marple settled herself in the drawing-room, where the faint scent of lavender still clung. Her eyes moved again over the table, the sherry glass now removed, the chair where Mrs. Ellison had died, and the bookshelf where she had noticed the playing cards. She asked Alice, almost absent-mindedly, whether the police had taken away the deck. "No, miss," Alice said. "They didn't think it mattered." Miss Marple requested to see it again, and Alice fetched it. The deck was old but complete, except, of course, for the Queen of Hearts. Miss Marple fanned the cards idly, noticing a faint smudge on the corner of the King of Spades. She set them down carefully, her mind filing it away. As she rose to go, she paused in the hallway, her gaze falling on the umbrella stand. It was an untidy arrangement. Several umbrellas, a walking stick she knew had belonged to Mr. Ellison, and a newer one, sleek and polished. Miss Marple stooped to examine it, noticing a faint chip on the silver handle. "Alice, dear," she asked, "is this yours?" Alice shook her head. "No, miss, I've never seen it before." Miss Marple only smiled faintly and made her goodbyes. That night, over her knitting, she thought about that stick. Denning's cane was similar, though she could not be certain it was the same. She thought also about the card, how deliberately it had been placed, how unnecessary it was unless it was meant to draw attention away from something else entirely. The next morning, she took a quiet stroll into the high street, stopping into the chemist's shop. Mr. Johnson, the chemist, was a man who prided himself on discretion, but he was also no match for Miss Marple's gentle curiosity. She inquired, purely hypothetically, about the sort of people who purchased digitalis. "Oh, hardly anyone these days," Johnson said. "Mostly those with prescriptions, heart conditions, you know. I keep careful records." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, examining a tin of lozenges she did not intend to buy. "And have you had any such requests of late? Perhaps from someone recently returned to the village?" Johnson hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Well, there was one order a month ago. Mr. Charles Denning said it was for an elderly aunt in Brighton. Perfectly legal, of course." Miss Marple thanked him kindly and left, her thoughts now aligned in a most troubling pattern. Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock stopped by again, visibly irritable. "The trouble with this case," he said, "is that everything points to Denning, but nothing can be proved. No evidence, no motive, nothing. If he's our man, he's too clever by half." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Oh, cleverness can be a dangerous thing, Inspector. Sometimes clever people are so busy arranging their stage that they leave a small detail out of place." Craddock frowned. "And you think there's a detail out of place here?" Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Oh, I'm quite certain of it. One only has to look in the right direction." As she spoke, her eyes lingered not on Craddock, but on the vase of roses upon her table, freshly cut that morning, their thorns neatly trimmed. A memory stirred of Mrs. Ellison's own vases, always left to Alice to prepare. If someone else had arranged them the night of her death, well, such small domestic matters were rarely noticed by men like Craddock. Miss Marple knew she would need to return to the Ellison house once more. This time to look not for what was there, but for what had been changed. The next morning was cool and still, the sort of weather Miss Marple always thought made people careless in their movements. She took advantage of that carelessness. Inspector Craddock had gone to Much Benham to follow up on routine inquiries, leaving the Ellison house free from official attention. Miss Marple called on Alice again, ostensibly to see if the poor girl needed help managing the flowers or linen. Alice, worn and pale from days of questioning, was glad enough to have her. Miss Marple wandered quietly through the house as she spoke, her eyes tracing corners others might not bother to check. The drawing room looked much as it had before, but it was the little details that caught her. Mrs. Ellison's knitting bag tucked just under the side table, a pair of spectacles laid neatly by a book she hadn't opened in days. A life interrupted, but not in chaos. As Alice brought in tea, Miss Marple remarked with her usual softness, "Such a kind gentleman, Mr. Denning, to call and pay his respects." Alice hesitated a fraction too long before answering. "Yes, miss. He brought some flowers the other day." Miss Marple smiled faintly. How thoughtful of him. He must have a good eye for arranging them, though I suppose it's unusual for a gentleman to do so himself. Alice flushed. Well, he insisted. Said he wanted to place them just as she liked. Miss Marple's hands stilled on her teacup. She did not comment further, but the thought nestled into place. A man arranging flowers, alone in a room, with ample opportunity to add or remove something from a vase. Before she left, Miss Marple asked if she might take a small cutting from the blooms in the drawing room. Alice, bemused, agreed. Miss Marple wrapped the little sprig of foxglove leaves, innocuous to anyone but a gardener like herself, and tucked it into her basket. She returned to her cottage and spent the afternoon writing a short note to Inspector Craddock, who arrived later looking perplexed and slightly out of breath. "You said you had something?" he asked, glancing at the folded paper on her table. Miss Marple only smiled. "Just a question for you, Inspector. Has anyone examined the vases of flowers in Mrs. Ellison's drawing room?" Craddock frowned. "Flowers? Number, why would we?" "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "if someone wished to administer a dose of digitalis without it being taken in drink, there are other ways. For example, a person might handle certain plants, then offer food, or perhaps arrange flowers, ensuring the oil transfers to a surface the victim would touch." Craddock stared at her, his brows drawn. "You think the poison came from the flowers?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that it is remarkable how foxglove blooms were included among the roses. Mrs. Ellison never liked foxglove in her arrangements, and Mr. Denning, apparently, arranged them himself." Craddock left looking both astonished and annoyed with himself for not having noticed sooner. The following afternoon, Denning was seen once again near the Ellison house. Miss Marple happened to be in the lane, knitting in hand as he tipped his hat with that practiced smile. "Still tending to poor Alice, Miss Marple?" "Such a sad business," she agreed, "though it must be some comfort to you to know you were one of Mrs. Ellison's last guests." His smile faltered almost imperceptibly, but he recovered at once. Indeed, she was a remarkable woman. Miss Marple watched him walk away, her mind noting each shift of expression. A man at ease did not glance back twice to see who might be watching him. A man at ease did not stiffen ever so slightly when foxglove was mentioned in passing. Later that evening, she walked to the vicarage to share her thoughts with Reverend Clement over tea. "You see," she explained, "it is not just what one does, but how one does it. Mr. Denning has been very careful to show the village his concern, calling on Alice, visiting the house, but always in ways that allow him to be alone in the very rooms where evidence might be found. That is a dangerous habit in a clever man." The Reverend looked troubled. "Do you think he means to remove something?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily. "I think," she said, "that he means to ensure nothing remains." The next day brought a curious turn. Alice appeared at Miss Marple's door, flustered. "Miss Marple, you wouldn't believe it. Someone's taken the vase of flowers from the drawing room. I can't find it anywhere. It was there yesterday." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind sharpened. "Oh, my dear, that is troublesome. Perhaps it was moved for cleaning." Alice shook her head. "No, miss. I'd never move it without saying." Miss Marple sent her home with a basket of scones, then walked slowly back into the village. It was not the loss of the vase that interested her. It was the urgency behind removing it. Someone had realized too late that a detail had been left out of place. In the evening, Inspector Craddock called once more, his voice low and grim. "We found the vase, Miss Marple, broken in a rubbish heap behind the inn. And you were right, there were foxglove blooms in it. We're sending them for analysis." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised, though her eyes twinkled faintly. How very clumsy of someone to dispose of it so carelessly. A clever man ought to have done better. The pieces were aligning now. The card, the flowers, the careful staging of the scene. It all spoke of someone who understood how to direct attention away from the truth. But Denning had made the oldest mistake of all. He had assumed no one in St. Mary Mead would notice the small, quiet things. The next morning was cool and still, the sort of weather Miss Marple always thought made people careless in their movements. She took advantage of that carelessness. Inspector Craddock had gone to Much Benham to follow up on routine inquiries, leaving the Ellison house free from official attention. Miss Marple called on Alice again, ostensibly to see if the poor girl needed help managing the flowers or linen. Alice, worn and pale from days of questioning, was glad enough to have her. Miss Marple wandered quietly through the house as she spoke, her eyes tracing corners others might not bother to check. The drawing-room looked much as it had before, but it was the little details that caught her. Mrs. Ellison's knitting bag tucked just under the side table, a pair of spectacles laid neatly by a book she hadn't opened in days. A life interrupted, but not in chaos. As Alice brought in tea, Miss Marple remarked with her usual softness, "Such a kind gentleman, Mr. Denning, to call and pay his respects." Alice hesitated a fraction too long before answering. "Yes, miss. He brought some flowers the other day." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How thoughtful of him. He must have a good eye for arranging them, though I suppose it's unusual for a gentleman to do so himself." Alice flushed. "Well, he insisted. Said he wanted to place them just as she liked." Miss Marple's hands stilled on her teacup. She did not comment further, but the thought nestled into place. A man arranging flowers, alone in a room, with ample opportunity to add or remove something from a vase. Before she left, Miss Marple asked if she might take a small cutting from the blooms in the drawing-room. Alice, bemused, agreed. Miss Marple wrapped the little sprig of foxglove leaves, innocuous to anyone but a gardener like herself, and tucked it into her basket. She returned to her cottage and spent the afternoon writing a short note to Inspector Craddock, who arrived later looking perplexed and slightly out of breath. "You said you had something?" he asked, glancing at the folded paper on her table. Miss Marple only smiled. "Just a question for you, Inspector. Has anyone examined the vases of flowers in Mrs. Ellison's drawing-room?" Craddock frowned. "Flowers? Why would we?" "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "if someone wished to administer a dose of digitalis without it being taken in drink, there are other ways. For example, a person might handle certain plants, then offer food, or perhaps arrange flowers, ensuring the oil transfers to a surface the victim would touch." Craddock stared at her, his brows drawn. "You think the poison came from the flowers?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that it is remarkable how foxglove blooms were included among the roses. Mrs. Ellison never liked foxglove in her arrangements, and Mr. Denning, apparently, arranged them himself." Craddock left looking both astonished and annoyed with himself for not having noticed sooner. The following afternoon, Denning was seen once again near the Ellison house. Miss Marple happened to be in the lane, knitting in hand as he tipped his hat with that practiced smile. "Still tending to poor Alice, Miss Marple?" "Such a sad business," she agreed, "though it must be some comfort to you to know you were one of Mrs. Ellison's last guests." His smile faltered almost imperceptibly, but he recovered at once. Indeed, she was a remarkable woman. Miss Marple watched him walk away, her mind noting each shift of expression. A man at ease did not glance back twice to see who might be watching him. A man at ease did not stiffen ever so slightly when foxglove was mentioned in passing. Later that evening, she walked to the vicarage to share her thoughts with Reverend Clement over tea. "You see," she explained, "it is not just what one does, but how one does it. Mr. Denning has been very careful to show the village his concern, calling on Alice, visiting the house, but always in ways that allow him to be alone in the very rooms where evidence might be found. That is a dangerous habit in a clever man." The Reverend looked troubled. "Do you think he means to remove something?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily. "I think," she said, "that he means to ensure nothing remains." The next day brought a curious turn. Alice appeared at Miss Marple's door, flustered. "Miss Marple, you wouldn't believe it. Someone's taken the vase of flowers from the drawing room. I can't find it anywhere. It was there yesterday." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind sharpened. "Oh, my dear, that is troublesome. Perhaps it was moved for cleaning." Alice shook her head. "No, miss. I'd never move it without saying." Miss Marple sent her home with a basket of scones, then walked slowly back into the village. It was not the loss of the vase that interested her. It was the urgency behind removing it. Someone had realized too late that a detail had been left out of place. In the evening, Inspector Craddock called once more, his voice low and grim. "We found the vase, Miss Marple, broken in a rubbish heap behind the inn. And you were right, there were foxglove blooms in it. We're sending them for analysis." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised, though her eyes twinkled faintly. How very clumsy of someone to dispose of it so carelessly. A clever man ought to have done better. The pieces were aligning now. The card, the flowers, the careful staging of the scene. It all spoke of someone who understood how to direct attention away from the truth. But Denning had made the oldest mistake of all. He had assumed no one in St. Mary Mead would notice the small, quiet things. Inspector Craddock had arranged for a quiet series of follow-up interviews at the vicarage, away from the hum of the police station. Miss Marple, ostensibly there to pour tea, sat quietly in her usual chair. Her presence was barely noticed, which suited her perfectly. People rarely guarded their tongues around a harmless old lady who seemed more interested in her knitting than in the business at hand. The first to arrive was Alice, looking strained. Craddock gently went over her account again, from Mrs. Ellison's final evening to the moment she found her employer lifeless. Alice stuck to her story, but faltered on one small point. "You said Mr. Denning left at 8:30, Craddock reminded her. "Yes, sir," Alice said, wringing her hands. "I remember because I just put the kettle on for Mrs. Ellison." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "And you brought her the tea yourself?" Alice nodded. "Yes, miss. She liked it in her blue china cup. Always did." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Ah, but I seem to remember seeing the white set on the tray that night when I visited later. I do hope I'm not mistaken." Alice blinked, confusion clouding her face. "Oh, well, yes, perhaps it was the white set. I must have got muddled." Miss Marple looked down at her knitting. People often did get muddled, but sometimes that muddle came from someone gently nudging them away from a truth they were reluctant to share. The next to be questioned was Mr. Denning. He entered the vicarage with his usual composure, dressed impeccably and offering polite condolences yet again. Craddock asked him to recount the evening in detail. Denning's voice was smooth, his answers confident. "Yes, I arrived shortly after 7, and we conversed in the drawing room. I brought flowers as a token of sympathy, knowing she'd been feeling unwell. We shared a glass of sherry. I left just before 9. Craddock narrowed his eyes. "Alice says you left at 8:30. Denning gave a polite laugh. "Ah, memories in a household under strain are bound to be imprecise. But I distinctly recall the clock striking the hour as I took my leave." Miss Marple's head tilted ever so slightly. "And you walked home? On your leg? That must have been quite fatiguing." Denning's smile froze briefly. "It was no trouble, Miss Marple. I'm used to the distance." Her eyes rested on his cane, the silver handle gleaming faintly. She wondered whether he had noticed that the umbrella stand at the Ellison house now held one less item than before. After Denning, Mrs. Price Ridley was brought in. She was eager, far too eager, to supply information. She claimed to have seen Denning leaving the Ellison house, smiling like the cat that got the cream, as she put it. She also mentioned, in a voice full of significance, that she had once seen Alice meeting a man at the post office late in the evening. Craddock raised an eyebrow. And who was this man? Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips. I couldn't say. I'm not one to spread tales without proof. But she seemed flustered. Miss Marple thanked her for her contribution, offering a plate of biscuits. She knew Mrs. Price Ridley's kind, quick to see scandal, quick to embellish. But there was sometimes a kernel of truth buried in the gossip. Reverend Clement came next, unwilling but cooperative. He had visited Mrs. Ellison 2 days before her death at her request. She was worried about her affairs, he explained. She asked about changing her will, but she seemed uncertain. I advised her to take her time. Miss Marple glanced up from her knitting. Did she mention who might benefit from such a change? The vicar hesitated. She only said she had been thinking of leaving a bequest to someone who had been kind to her lately. She didn't name the person. Craddock scribbled in his notebook, his expression darkening. The final visitor that afternoon was young Peter Simmons, a stable hand from the edge of the village. He looked nervous, tugging at his cap. I didn't see much, sir, he told Craddock, but I did see Mr. Denning near the back lane of the Ellison place late that night. Thought it was odd. He said he'd dropped his glove earlier. Craddock leaned forward. And did he find it? Peter shrugged. Don't know, sir. But he didn't look like he was searching when I saw him. Just waiting. Miss Marple's knitting paused for only a heartbeat before resuming. By the time the last witness left, the air in the vicarage felt heavier. Craddock looked frustrated, shuffling his notes. They're all contradicting each other in little ways, but nothing we can pin down. Half of it is probably gossip, the other half mistakes in memory. Miss Marple looked up mildly. Oh, memories are rarely precise, Inspector, but when one sees the same kind of imprecision always leaning in the same direction, that is quite revealing. Craddock frowned. And which direction is that? She smiled faintly. Toward Mr. Denning, of course, but we must let him believe his stage is still perfectly set. People often grow careless just before the curtain falls. The contradictions from the vicarage interviews lingered like a faint scent of smoke after a fire. Something had burned there, even if the source was not yet visible. Miss Marple sat by her window that evening, her knitting lying idle as she sifted through what she had heard. Denning's calm veneer, Alice's hesitations, Mrs. Price Ridley's eagerness to spread scandal, and the vicar's careful vagueness all spun together in her mind. Each had their own motive, though none fit the entire puzzle neatly. Alice, so devoted to her mistress, had perhaps too much to lose if gossip about her and a mysterious man reached the wrong ears. A dismissal without reference could leave her stranded, but there was no malice in her eyes. Only fear, and perhaps guilt of a different kind. Mrs. Price Ridley's interest was almost too straightforward, a taste for meddling and the satisfaction of seeing a respected figure fall from grace. But such a motive was for talk, not murder. She thrived on whispered insinuations, not finality. The vicar troubled Miss Marple more than she cared to admit. Not for any violent inclination, she could not imagine Reverend Clement so much as harming a wasp. But because of the will. A bequest to someone who had been kind lately could open doors to temptation in unexpected quarters. She had seen too often how even the most upright could rationalize a little self-interest. But Denning was different. His visits, his charm, the flowers, the quiet manipulation of time and memory. He was at the center of every inconsistency, and yet his motive was still veiled. A mere infatuation with the widow's fortune? Possibly. But Miss Marple suspected a longer game. The following day she contrived to call on Alice again, bringing with her a small bundle of mending and an air of casual conversation. She let her eyes wander over the room as she spoke. "Alice, my dear," she said gently, "I was thinking about that gentleman you were seen with at the post office. It must be difficult, having friends when one works in a household that depends on appearances." Alice flushed. "It was nothing improper, miss. Just my cousin Jack. He was in some trouble over money, and I lent him a little. I didn't want Mrs. Ellison to know." Miss Marple's voice remained soothing. "Quite understandable. But trouble over money does make one vulnerable, doesn't it? People might use it against you, or pressure you to do things you'd rather not." Alice looked alarmed, but Miss Marple patted her hand and changed the subject to scones. The seed, however, had been planted. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock pursued the will. The solicitor confirmed that Mrs. Ellison had inquired about changes, but no documents had been signed. "She was considering naming a Mr. Denning in a small legacy," he said. "Nothing substantial, but she spoke warmly of him." Craddock relayed this to Miss Marple, who nodded as though she had expected nothing else. "Small legacies are curious things, Inspector. They are often enough to tempt someone with little patience, but not enough to satisfy them. That creates urgency." The pattern of visits also drew her attention. Denning's calls coincided suspiciously with days when Alice was sent on errands, leaving him alone with Mrs. Ellison. On one such afternoon, Mrs. Price Ridley had dropped by unannounced and claimed she saw papers on the table, though she could not say what they were. Miss Marple wondered if this too was part of the performance. Still, there was another strand. Young Peter Simmons' sighting of Denning near the back lane raised a question. Why return at night if he had already left hours earlier? Searching for a glove was an excuse so poor it seemed designed to be dismissed. Miss Marple suspected he had been there to ensure something was left or removed. By now, the web was tightening. The motives were tangled. Alice's fear for her position, the vicar's discretion about the will, Mrs. Price Ridley's delight in scandal, Peter's nervous loyalty to no one in particular. Yet each of these threads looped back to Denning. He had charm enough to manipulate them all, and ambition enough to use every weakness to his advantage. Miss Marple spent that evening by her fire, letting the threads in her mind settle. Greed was obvious. But there was also revenge. Subtle, patient revenge. Denning's connection to Mrs. Ellison was too deliberate to be mere chance. She recalled a vague mention, years ago, of a young man denied a business loan by her late husband. Could that young man have been Denning, now older, smoother, and with a more dangerous plan? It was still conjecture, but Miss Marple knew one thing. The motives had formed a complete circle. The only way to unravel it would be to set them all in motion together and see who stumbled. It was 3 mornings later when Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with a certain air of satisfaction, the sort of expression that suggested a case was about to be neatly tied off with ribbon. He accepted a cup of tea, set his hat on the side table, and announced, "We've found something that changes everything." Miss Marple's eyes widened politely. "Oh? How very efficient of you, Inspector. And what might that be?" "A glove," Craddock said. "A black leather glove. Found half buried near the back lane behind Mrs. Ellison's garden. It matches the description young Simmons gave when Denning claimed he was looking for it that night, and—" He paused for effect. "It's got a smear of arsenic residue on the lining." Miss Marple did not move her hands from her knitting, though the faintest flicker crossed her expression. "Arsenic," she repeated softly. "Dear me, that is most unfortunate. For Mr. Denning, I assume." Craddock nodded. "We've brought him in. His connection to Mrs. Ellison, the will, his suspicious movements that evening. It all fits neatly. He's protesting, of course, but I think we've got him this time." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes fixed on the steam curling from the cup. "Neatly," she murmured, "is such a dangerous word, Inspector. Life is rarely neat. It's usually rather untidy, unless, of course, someone has tidied it for you." But Craddock was already rising, full of energy at the prospect of closing the file. "I'll let you know when the confession comes through, Miss Marple. We can finally put this matter to rest." When he had gone, the cottage seemed quieter than usual. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and stared thoughtfully out the window. The discovery of the glove was almost too perfect. Its location, its damning residue, its direct tie to Denning. Too perfect indeed for a man as careful as he. She had seen many cases where an overconfident man stumbled, but Denning struck her as someone who avoided stumbling entirely unless it served him. That afternoon she took a walk toward the Ellison house. Alice was in the kitchen, subdued but visibly relieved. "It'll be over soon, miss," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Inspector says they've found the proof. I knew Mr. Denning was trouble." Miss Marple looked at her mildly. "Proof is a very comforting thing, my dear, but it can be misleading if one doesn't ask who placed it where it could be found." Alice frowned. "You mean someone planted it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I mean only that we must be very certain about the kind of man we are dealing with. Some men conceal their guilt, and others arrange it in plain sight for someone else to wear." By the next day, word had spread through St. Mary Mead that Denning's arrest was imminent. Mrs. Price Ridley stopped Miss Marple on the lane to remark that it was just as she had always suspected, and a fine example of justice served. The vicar, when she met him at the grocer's, seemed quietly relieved as well. It was this very relief that made Miss Marple uneasy. People were too eager to accept Denning's guilt, as though it smoothed over all their small fears and contradictions. A truly guilty man would have left behind more ragged threads. That evening, Craddock returned, his mood dampened. "Denning still isn't confessing," he admitted. "We've shown him the glove, the will, even brought in Simmons to confirm seeing him near the lane. He says it's all circumstantial." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "And does it not strike you, Inspector, that for a man of Denning's intelligence, being found wandering near the lane would be rather convenient if one needed an explanation later for something being found there?" Craddock frowned. "You think he wanted to be suspected?" "I think," said Miss Marple softly, "that the person who placed the glove there wanted us to be certain of whom to suspect, and certainty can be the most dangerous thing in an investigation." Craddock stared at her for a moment before letting out a frustrated breath. "You think the real killer's still out there?" Miss Marple's eyes were distant, her voice calm. "I think the play isn't over yet, Inspector, and the one who wrote the script is still waiting in the wings." Inspector Craddock's unease did not fade with Denning's continued denials. The glove, once a triumphant piece of evidence, now sat in his mind like an ill-fitting puzzle piece. Miss Marple's quiet words had taken root, and though he would never admit it outright, he found himself retracing steps rather than finalizing paperwork. Miss Marple herself, of course, continued in her usual way, visiting neighbors, tending her garden, and appearing the very picture of gentle distraction. Yet beneath this surface, she was gently tugging at threads that had been left untouched. It was during a conversation with the vicar's wife over tea and seed catalogues that a small remark nudged her thoughts in a new direction. Of course, Mrs. Ellison was not always so fond of company. Mrs. Clement remarked idly. For years she avoided entertaining anyone from the village, save the sewing circle. It was only in the past 6 months she began inviting people in. Mr. Denning, Mrs. Price Ridley, even poor Alice's cousin once or twice. Quite a change, don't you think? Miss Marple smiled faintly, but her mind stirred. 6 months. That was not merely social whim. It was a shift in behavior. She recalled another conversation, many years ago, when a younger Mrs. Ellison had abruptly ended her involvement with the Women's Institute over a dispute involving funds. There had been whispers of a betrayal. Whispers that had faded, as they always did, into the soft dust of village memory. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mr. Pritchard, the retired solicitor who now spent his days tending roses. She made polite enquiries about soil and pruning before gently steering the conversation toward old disputes. Mr. Pritchard, who enjoyed nothing so much as a faintly scandalous reminiscence, soon obliged. It was a dull little matter at the time, he said, but caused quite the upset among the ladies. A trust fund for a charitable project meant to support war widows was mishandled. A certain gentleman investor was involved. His name escapes me. Douglas? No. Densham? Denning, that's it. Though he was much younger then, and under another name for business purposes. Left some debts behind, I believe. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly in her lap. How very interesting. And Mrs. Ellison was connected to this fund, was she not? She chaired the committee, Pritchard confirmed, though she kept rather quiet about the whole thing after the money vanished. Quite sensible, I suppose, but it was said she never forgave the man responsible. That evening, by her fire, Miss Marple reviewed the pieces. Denning had been in Mrs. Ellison's life once before, under circumstances that would have left resentment on her part and unfinished business on his. His sudden reappearance was unlikely to be coincidence, but there was more to it than mere revenge. Others in the village had been linked to that old scandal. Small connections, easily forgotten. Mrs. Price Ridley's late husband, for example, had invested a modest sum in that same fund. She had never spoken of it publicly, but Miss Marple remembered her air of aggrieved superiority toward Mrs. Ellison after the matter went quiet. And Alice, loyal Alice, had a cousin Jack who seemed perpetually short of money. His surname, Miss Marple now recalled, matched that of one of the clerks who had been questioned in the affair, but never charged. This was no random gathering of people at Mrs. Ellison's table. Whether by chance or design, the circle around her now was tied by faint but undeniable threads to a scandal buried in the past. The following day, she walked to the lane where the glove had been found. The earth there was disturbed, yes, but in a manner suggesting it had been recently loosened from beneath rather than dropped freshly on top. Someone had been digging, not merely planting evidence, but perhaps retrieving something long hidden. Miss Marple stood very still, her eyes scanning the hedge line, the path, the curve of the lane. A plan was beginning to take shape, not one of confrontation just yet, but of quiet observation. The past was moving beneath the surface, and soon enough it would break through. Miss Marple's mind worked as quietly as her knitting needles, each loop and knot forming a pattern invisible to anyone not watching closely. She had no intention of confronting anyone directly. Not yet. What she needed was something subtle, something that would unsettle the calm surfaces and show her where the ripples ran deepest. The opportunity came in the form of a casual afternoon tea. It was nothing out of the ordinary in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple often invited neighbors to her garden when the weather was fair. But this invitation was particular. She asked Mrs. Price Ridley, Alice, and even young Simmons, along with Inspector Craddock, under the pretense of discussing the case's moral implications. Denning, still under suspicion but not formally charged, was also invited. Her tea table was laid with her finest china, though each cup was mismatched, a tiny detail that had always amused her guests. But today she noticed who reached for what without hesitation, and who hesitated as if unsure of their place. Small discomforts told her as much as words. As they settled, Miss Marple spoke cheerfully of village events, gently circling the topic of the late Mrs. Ellison. She mentioned the Old Women's Institute Fund as though it were a harmless curiosity from decades past. "I was thinking," she said with an air of mild confusion, "how strange it is that so many of us were involved in that committee, directly or indirectly. Why, Mrs. Price Ridley, didn't your dear husband contribute a tidy sum? And Alice, wasn't your cousin Jack involved as a clerk in some capacity?" There was a pause, brief but telling. Mrs. Price Ridley's teacup halted midway to her lips before she forced a brittle smile. "A very long time ago, Miss Marple. Hardly relevant now." Alice, by contrast, flushed and looked down at her lap. "Jack was just a boy then, miss. It wasn't his fault." Denning leaned back, the faintest smirk curling his lips. "Ah, yes, the famous fund. A shame about the outcome, but I'm sure we've all moved on, haven't we? His eyes flicked toward Mrs. Price Ridley in a way that made her stiffen. Miss Marple let the silence draw out, pouring more tea as though nothing had happened. Then she produced, from her knitting bag, a small object, a leather-bound address book. I came across this when sorting through some old papers Mrs. Ellison gave me years ago, she said mildly. So many familiar names, though I was surprised, Mr. Denning, to see yours in an earlier form. Densham, wasn't it? Denning's expression did not change, but his fingers tightened slightly on his cup. A harmless business alias. Perfectly common practice. Indeed, Miss Marple said sweetly. But it is curious how names change over time, just as fortunes do. It can be so hard to keep track, unless one has an excellent memory. Inspector Craddock, watching quietly, caught the slight shift in Simmons' posture. The young man, until then unremarkable, had gone pale at the mention of names. His eyes darted toward Alice, who refused to meet his gaze. Miss Marple chatted on, speaking of village gardens, then quite suddenly asked, "I wonder, has anyone seen the key Mrs. Ellison always kept for her writing desk? I've heard it has gone missing since her death." Quite a sentimental little piece. It was a simple remark, but it was Simmons who reacted. Too quickly, too nervously. I wouldn't know, miss. I never touched her things." His voice cracked slightly, and Craddock's sharp glance caught it. Miss Marple only nodded, offering him another slice of seed cake. But she had seen enough. Her unusual tactic was not in the object itself, but in watching the very human discomfort it stirred. Each reaction told her who was fearful, who was angry, and who was quietly amused. The past was still alive at her tea table, and someone's careful mask had just begun to slip. Inspector Craddock left Miss Marple's cottage that evening with the distinct feeling that something had shifted. The little gathering had been on the surface all tea and seed cake, yet there had been that unmistakable ripple when certain names were mentioned. He intended to review the glove's provenance again and see whether Simmons' odd reaction to the desk key might lead somewhere. But by the following morning, that course was abruptly frustrated. The glove, carefully stored in the police evidence room, was gone. At first there was talk of clerical error, then of misplacement, but when the storage log was checked, there was no mistake. Someone had signed it out. The signature was a crude imitation of Craddock's own. The discovery sent a ripple of unease through the station. This was no accident, nor was it the work of some careless constable. Someone had gone to deliberate lengths to remove the most damning physical link in the case, and that someone was willing to tamper with police records to do it. Miss Marple, when informed, did not look surprised. She merely set down her knitting and remarked, "Well, dear Inspector, we did expect as much, didn't we? A person desperate enough to kill will be equally desperate to tidy up afterwards. One must be very careful about brooms, you know. They sometimes sweep up what ought not to be. Moved." Craddock muttered something uncharitable about village metaphors, but he was rattled. The missing glove meant the case against Denning had all but dissolved, and though Craddock still distrusted the man, he could no longer hold him. Denning's lawyer wasted no time securing his release, and the man walked free with a smile that was almost a challenge. That afternoon, another blow came. The address book Miss Marple had shown at tea, a harmless thing in appearance, yet subtly important, had vanished from her side table. She had intended to hand it to Craddock for safekeeping, but when she went to fetch it, it was gone. "I do so dislike untidy people," she murmured, more to herself than to the inspector when he came to call. Especially when they go rummaging about where they shouldn't. One does wonder if they found what they were looking for, or if they were merely frightened by what I might have. The stakes had changed. Someone inside the small circle of suspects knew the investigation was pressing too close and was moving quickly to erase traces. Miss Marple understood that such haste often betrayed more than it concealed. It meant the person could not afford to let the truth breathe for even a day. She began to notice other signs. Alice, pale and jumpy, as though expecting someone to confront her at any moment. Mrs. Price Ridley closing her curtains earlier than usual, claiming she disliked the evening chill. Simmons avoiding the high street altogether. Denning, on the other hand, was brazen, as if the loss of evidence proved his innocence rather than deepened suspicion. Miss Marple saw it differently. The vanishing items were not a sign of cleverness. They were the acts of someone trapped, striking at anything that might expose them. She suspected the missing objects had not been destroyed, only relocated. And those who steal in fear, she knew, rarely have the patience to hide things well. It was no longer simply a matter of who had the motive. It was now a question of who had the most to lose in the present moment, and who had been quick enough to move before the net tightened. The disappearance of the glove and address book had unsettled the case, but the village settled into an uneasy rhythm, as if waiting for the storm to either pass or break. Miss Marple sensed it keenly. She had lived long enough to know that a culprit who has acted twice will rarely stop there. Desperation has its own momentum. Her unease proved justified 2 days later. Late in the afternoon, just as dusk began to tint the sky a bruised violet, Inspector Craddock received an urgent call from Alice's lodgings. The landlady, her voice trembling, reported that Alice had not been seen since morning. She had left the house in her usual hat and coat, but had not returned. A small suitcase was missing from her room, and so too was a bundle of letters she had been keeping in her desk drawer. Craddock went at once, finding the room curiously neat. Too neat, in Miss Marple's estimation, when she accompanied him there shortly after. "It is always suspicious," she remarked, "when someone in a hurry leaves everything so tidy. I should say, dear Inspector, that she meant us to think she has run away, when in fact she may have been helped to vanish." Her words took on sharper meaning the following morning when a fisherman found Alice's handbag near the bank of the river, its clasp broken, contents scattered in the reeds. There was no sign of Alice herself. The discovery sent the village into a panic, whispers of a second tragedy stirring old fears. Craddock ordered a search of the river and surrounding countryside, but there was no trace. The suitcase, the letters, and Alice herself had disappeared completely. Miss Marple walked quietly along the bank, her eyes not on the water but on the churned mud near the path. "It is curious," she said softly. "One expects certain marks if a person has stumbled or thrown something in. But here, there are impressions of 2 sets of shoes, and one pair was rather heavier than a young woman's. Size 9, I think. And see here, someone has dragged something, or someone." Craddock frowned, following her gaze. The scene was no suicide or flight. It was the work of someone who wanted Alice gone. Whether Alice was still alive was another question. The case, already tense, shifted sharply. The second incident proved the killer, or at least the mastermind, was still ahead of them. This was not just about solving a past crime. It was about stopping an active danger. Miss Marple, though outwardly as composed as ever, felt the urgency keenly. The person who had killed Mrs. Ellison, or orchestrated her death, was not finished. They had tried to remove the trail of evidence. Now they were removing the witnesses who might tie them to the truth. And if Alice had been silenced, there was every chance someone else in the small circle would be next. The difficulty, Miss Marple thought, was that the culprit now believed themselves clever enough to act with impunity. That arrogance could be their undoing, if only she could provoke it at precisely the right moment. The village's mood turned grim in the days following Alice's disappearance. People spoke in hushed voices in the grocer's, avoided lingering in the post office, and glanced over their shoulders on the high street. Inspector Craddock kept his men moving through interviews, searching for any trace of Alice or the missing suitcase, but the trail seemed to dissolve into mist. Miss Marple, however, did not allow herself to be rushed. She spent her afternoons moving quietly from shop to shop, from garden gate to front step, gathering fragments of conversation as only she could. It was at Mrs. Price Ridley's tea that a curious thread began to tug at her mind. The lady, complaining about the nuisance of police stamping through her hydrangeas, made an offhand remark about the awful smell of Denning's cigars that seemed to hang about the village hall after the meeting earlier in the week. On the surface, it was an inconsequential complaint, but Miss Marple thought of Denning's alibi for the night of Mrs. Ellison's death, which had placed him at the hall earlier than anyone else. He had claimed he was there only briefly, yet Mrs. Price Ridley's comment implied he had stayed long enough, and close enough, to leave a lingering trace. That suggested movement no one had accounted for. Then there was Simmons, the estate manager, who seemed incapable of answering questions without producing a sheaf of papers. His constant shuffling and rearranging of documents struck Miss Marple as more than nervousness. It was a habit, a way of hiding or producing papers at will. She remembered the desk key and how protective he'd been over Ellison's study. It was a visit to the vicarage that sharpened her thoughts further. The vicar's wife, in her gentle way, remarked that Alice had been so very relieved after her first interview with the police because she had finally told the truth about the will. But the will had not been a focus of the investigation, at least not in Craddock's official line of questioning. If Alice had spoken of it unprompted, then she had known more than she had admitted. The threads began to cross in Miss Marple's mind. Denning's presence near the hall at the wrong time, Simmons' peculiar obsession with documents, Alice's nervous knowledge of a will. Each alone was a curiosity. Together, they began to form a pattern. She returned home and took out her notebook, the one she used for her garden, but which held her neat lists of suspects and their oddities. As she reviewed her notes, the realization settled over her like a frost. The case had always seemed tangled because she had been looking at the wrong strands. The true connection was not in the murder itself, but in the documents. Those papers everyone seemed either to avoid, hide, or remove. The will, the glove, the address book, the missing letters. Now Alice, who might have known enough to threaten the forger. Miss Marple smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. Plain sight, indeed, she murmured. The pattern had been there all along, under their noses. All that remained was to draw it tight enough that the person at its center had no choice but to betray themselves. Miss Marple's knitting lay idle in her lap that evening as she sat by the hearth, the fire casting a quiet, steady glow across her sitting room. She was thinking not of patterns in wool, but of patterns in people. The threads of the case were almost gathered now, and she could see their center clearly. The motive, when it emerged in her mind, was not the simple greed everyone had assumed. It was more personal, more desperate, and far more dangerous. Mrs. Ellison's will had been the visible prize, but wills can be altered, challenged, or contested. This crime, Miss Marple realized, had never been solely about securing money. It had been about erasing something that could not be undone by lawyers. The glove, the address book, the missing letters, they were not random. They were the remnants of a secret that Mrs. Ellison had kept carefully hidden, one that someone feared would come to light after her death. It was Alice's disappearance that crystallized it. Alice had been nervous, evasive, yet strangely loyal to someone she ought to have feared. Miss Marple thought back to the way Alice's eyes had darted, not toward Denning or Simmons, but toward a certain framed photograph in the Ellison drawing room. A photograph of a much younger Mrs. Ellison standing beside a man, not her late husband. Miss Marple knew the sort of whisper that could ruin a reputation in a village like this. She also knew that certain reputations were guarded more fiercely than fortunes. The truth began to take shape. Mrs. Ellison had been keeping a secret relationship, one that, if revealed, could destroy more than a name. The letters Alice had taken were not mere correspondence, but proof of a connection that implicated someone still very much alive. That person's position, respectability, and future would collapse if the truth surfaced. Denning, with his debts and charm, had been the perfect distraction, the visible suspect for a crime that was meant to look like a simple matter of inheritance. Simmons' nervous guarding of papers was not to protect money, but to ensure certain documents, love letters perhaps, or promises, never saw the light of day. Miss Marple could see it so clearly now. The crime had been born from fear, the fear of scandal. Murder was the price paid to keep a life's careful facade intact. It was not greed, but self-preservation, the kind that drives people to desperate, dangerous acts. She leaned back, her mind quietly turning over the psychology of it. Respectability, she had learned long ago, can be more powerful than money and far more dangerous when threatened. The villain in this case had not simply wanted to enrich themselves, they had wanted to protect their standing at all costs. That, she thought grimly, made them more dangerous than a common killer because they believed themselves righteous. Her blue eyes narrowed slightly. It was almost time to act, but she would need to tread with care. A person who kills to protect their good name will not hesitate to kill again. Miss Marple's plan was so quiet in execution that it passed almost unnoticed by those involved. A casual word to Inspector Craddock about a missing document, a gentle suggestion that the key suspects be gathered for a clarification of certain details, and the wheels began to turn. By the following afternoon, the drawing room at the Ellison house was prepared, not for tea, but for the final act of a drama that had played out beneath everyone's noses. The room was arranged, deliberately. Denning, lounging by the mantelpiece, his easy smile hiding a wary glint. Simmons, seated stiffly by the desk, his fingers twitching as though itching for his papers. Mrs. Price Ridley in a corner chair, pretending disinterest but devouring every word, and Inspector Craddock standing by the door, watchful. Alice had been brought back under police escort, pale but visibly relieved to no longer be on her own. Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting, appeared the least significant presence in the room. That illusion was precisely as she intended. "I think," she began, her voice mild, "that we might resolve matters today. It is really quite a simple business once one sees the pattern. Murder often is, you know, once one discards the irrelevancies." Denning's smile tightened. Simmons's eyes flicked toward the desk. "It was never about money," Miss Marple continued, her needles clicking softly, "though money is a convenient motive to display. The true concern was reputation, something far more delicate. Mrs. Ellison's papers contained letters that, if made public, would destroy a certain person's carefully constructed life." Simmons shifted, his hand brushing against his breast pocket. Miss Marple's eyes, though seemingly fixed on her knitting, missed nothing. "The first murder," she said, "was meant to prevent those letters from surfacing. But it created another problem. Miss Alice knew of the will, and she knew of the letters. Her disappearance, however dramatic it seemed, was simply a way to remove her until she could be persuaded to forget what she knew, or silenced if necessary." Alice's breath caught, and she stared at Simmons. Denning glanced at her, then back at Miss Marple as if gauging her intent. "And you see," Miss Marple went on gently, "there is a difficulty when one commits a crime for such a motive, because one must guard not only against the law, but against the truth itself, which has a curious habit of revealing itself in the smallest of ways. A misplaced glove, a whiff of cigar smoke, a letter gone missing only to reappear where it ought not." She looked up then, her blue eyes mild but sharp enough to cut through the room. "Mr. Simmons, perhaps you would be so good as to show us the contents of your inside pocket? I believe we will find something there that did not belong to you at all." Simmons's face went gray. His hand twitched again toward his jacket, but Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm. "Mr. Simmons, if you please." For a moment it seemed Simmons might refuse. His lips worked as though searching for words, his breath quickening. Then, in a sudden, desperate motion, He stood, knocking over his chair, and made for the door. Craddock intercepted him, catching his arm in a grip that left no room for struggle. The papers fell to the carpet, scattering in a fan of pale envelopes and brittle pages. Miss Marple bent slightly, picked one up with a gloved hand, and passed it to Craddock. "You will see, Inspector, that the handwriting matches Mrs. Ellison's, and the name to whom it is addressed will explain everything." Craddock scanned the page, his eyes narrowing as he took in the salutation. A hush fell over the room. Denning's smirk was gone now, replaced by a watchful tension. Alice sat rigid, her gaze fixed on Simmons, who sagged in Craddock's grip, his composure broken at last. Miss Marple's voice, when she spoke again, was soft but unyielding. "The fear of disgrace can be a powerful thing, Mr. Simmons, but it is rarely worth a life. And yet, here we are." The papers gathered from Simmons' pocket seemed to settle the matter. Craddock's men were already preparing to escort him away. Alice was leaning back in her chair with visible relief, and Denning, after a long breath, gave a faint shrug that looked suspiciously like resignation. Miss Marple, however, did not look satisfied. She glanced once more at Simmons, not with triumph, but with a certain quiet curiosity that had not been resolved. "You will take him to the station, Inspector?" she asked, her tone gentle but absent-minded, as though her thoughts were on something else entirely. "Yes, Miss Marple," Craddock replied, folding the incriminating letters carefully. "I think that will be the end of this business. A shame, really, over something so foolish." "Yes," Miss Marple said, looking down at her knitting. "Over something so foolish, or perhaps something far more dangerous." It was a very small remark, and it might have passed unnoticed, except that Denning's head turned sharply toward her, his smile a fraction too quick. Miss Marple observed this without comment. As the party began to disperse, she asked Alice if she might have a word with her. The young woman agreed, a little uncertainly, and Miss Marple's questions were deceptively casual. About the letters, about Mrs. Ellison's habits, about who had access to her writing desk. Alice answered dutifully, but each reply seemed to trouble Miss Marple further. It was only when Alice mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Denning had been the one to help Mrs. Ellison manage her correspondence after her husband's death that Miss Marple's needles stopped mid-click. "Dear me," she murmured softly, as if to herself. "How very odd." By the time she returned to the drawing room, Simmons was gone, but Denning remained, standing by the mantel as if he had taken root there. He looked relaxed, but there was a faint edge in his voice when he greeted her. "All wrapped up then, Miss Marple. A pity you weren't the prosecuting counsel. You'd have had Simmons confessing in 5 minutes." Miss Marple gave a small laugh. "Oh, my dear Mr. Denning, I think Mr. Simmons was a very convenient person indeed. But you see, there is a curious thing about those letters. The contents of Mrs. Ellison's desk were well known to her housekeeper, and yet it seems no one suspected their importance until you arrived." Denning's smile did not falter, but there was a flicker in his eyes, quick as the shadow of a passing bird. "And another curious matter," she continued mildly, "is that Mr. Simmons is quite clumsy in matters of subterfuge. He could never have arranged for the disappearance of the carbon copies in the solicitor's safe. That required someone with charm, confidence, and a certain freedom of access." Denning straightened slightly, his voice still smooth but his tone sharpening. "Are you suggesting something, Miss Marple?" "Suggesting?" Miss Marple's tone was all innocence. "Why, no. I'm only thinking aloud. But it is remarkable how the true architect of a crime will often remain nearby, quite confident that others will take the blame." She looked up at him, her blue eyes very mild, yet piercing. "It is such a comfort to believe one has been clever enough to remain unseen." The silence that followed was not long, but it was heavy. Craddock, sensing the shift, stepped subtly closer. Denning's expression changed, just enough to reveal that Miss Marple's arrow had found its mark. For the first time, his charm faltered. "You have no proof," he said very quietly. Miss Marple smiled faintly, almost regretfully. "Oh, my dear, there is proof enough. It is in the letter you removed from the solicitor's office, the one you thought was destroyed. I suspected it might have been clever of you to replace it with a harmless decoy. But the real one, well, I believe the inspector will be receiving it shortly, thanks to a certain careful copy Mrs. Ellison made years ago for her own protection. I took the liberty of inquiring. There was no sudden outburst, no attempt at flight. Denning only looked at her for a long, quiet moment, then laughed softly, though without mirth. "You really are extraordinary, Miss Marple." The sound of his voice lingered as Craddock stepped forward to place him under arrest, this time for far more than mere possession of letters. The room felt curiously still after Denning was taken away, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Alice stood frozen by the window, her hands gripping the sill, her face pale. Inspector Craddock lingered, clearly waiting for Miss Marple to speak, as though the case wasn't truly closed until she declared it so. "I don't understand," Alice said at last, her voice unsteady. "I thought it was Simmons. Everyone did. How could it have been Mr. Denning all along? He was so kind, so helpful." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting resting in her lap. "My dear, wickedness rarely comes in a form that is disagreeable at first sight. Mr. Denning was precisely the sort of man one is inclined to trust, a widower's confidant, a sympathetic ear. It is very often the agreeable ones one must watch most closely." Craddock frowned, rubbing his chin. "What I still can't see, Miss Marple, is how you were certain enough to set that trap. We had letters, opportunity, even motive for Simmons. What was it that convinced you?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, it was all very simple. Mr. Simmons was a desperate man, but he was also an untidy one. When I saw that the envelope containing Mrs. Ellison's letters had been neatly filed away, with the string tied in a bow, well, I knew he could not have been responsible. Neat bows are a sign of a tidy mind, Inspector, and Simmons' mind was not tidy at all. It was the sort of small domestic detail most people overlook." Craddock gave a half laugh, half groan. "You mean to say the bow gave him away?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple corrected gently. "The bow told me someone else was at work, and then there was Mr. Denning's little remark about the solicitor's safe. He claimed to have heard about the missing carbon copies only that morning, yet he spoke as though he had handled them himself. One does not make such slips unless one is very sure no one is listening closely." Alice turned to her, still shaken. "But why? Why go to such lengths? Was it just for the inheritance?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "It is almost always about money, my dear, but in this case it was also pride. Mr. Denning had been living well beyond his means for years. The friendship with your late husband gave him a footing in society he could never have achieved on his own. Your widowhood and your fortune were opportunities he could not resist. When Mrs. Ellison realized what he was doing and threatened to expose him, she had to be silenced. The letters were the final safeguard. Poor Simmons was merely a very convenient distraction." The words settled over the room like dust. Alice sank into a chair, her head bowed, while Craddock made a few brisk notes, his expression resigned. Later, as the last of the officials departed, Miss Marple gathered her things. Alice, still pale but calmer now, came to her side. "Miss Marple, I don't know how to thank you. If you hadn't been here," Miss Marple patted her hand, "you would have managed, my dear. One always does. But I am glad I was able to prevent a very dreadful mistake." She hesitated, then added quietly, "And I am glad Mr. Denning will not have the chance to charm some other poor soul into ruin." The carriage ride back to St. Mary Mead was quiet, the countryside rolling past in its usual calm indifference to human affairs. Yet Miss Marple's mind was not quite at rest. She knew Denning would face trial, and she knew the evidence against him was strong, but she also knew men of his kind, clever, persuasive, and entirely without conscience. Still, she consoled herself with the thought that truth, once revealed, is difficult to bury again, and perhaps that was justice enough.